السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. صباح الخير جميعا، إن شاء الله تكونوا بألف خير وصحة وسلامة يا رب أنتوا وجميع الأهل. اليوم محاضرتنا موضوعها عن الفيشل ديفلوبمنت، البارت 1، الجزء الأول من الفيشل ديفلوبمنت اللي هي تابعة لمحاضرة Oral Embryology 1. طبعا مواضيع المحاضرة راح تكون عن development of the face and development of the palate. Development of the face. Now we start with the facial development week by week. At 4 weeks in utero, during intrauterine life, we see here that the primitive oral cavity or stomodium is bounded by 5 facial swellings. These are the frontonasal process, the large process here, 2 maxillary processes, and 2 mandibular processes. Here is also 2 human embryos. They are both 4 weeks in utero. This is frontal view and this is lateral view. Again, we can identify the stomatodium here, and we identify the facial processes that surrounds the stomodium. This is also 4 weeks in utero, human embryo, and we can identify the stomodium, and that's surrounded by the 5 facial processes. There is a membrane called the oropharyngeal or buccopharyngeal membrane, which separates the oral cavity from the pharynx. This membrane appears during week 4 in utero, and this membrane ruptures by the end of week 4. This membrane is a bilaminar membrane. It has an outer ectodermal layer and inner endodermal layer. The membrane breaks down, leaving continuity between the ectodermally lined oral cavity and the endodermally lined pharynx. Here we are looking at sagittal section of a human embryo during week 4. You see, we can identify here the buccopharyngeal membrane, which separates the stomodium, oral cavity, from the pharynx. It's also called the foregut. So it's a membrane between the oral cavity and the foregut. This is a human embryo during week 5. Here we can identify the stomodium. Again, it's surrounded by frontonasal process, maxillary process, and mandibular process. Here we can also identify that there is a slight pit here. This is called the nasal pit at this stage. It's part of the frontonasal process. The nasal pit will be the future opening of the nasal cavity, or what's called the nostril. It starts its development as nasal placode. Placode is a thickening of the epithelium. So the nasal placode is a local thickening of the ectoderm at the site where the nasal pit will start to appear. So it starts as nasal placode, then it becomes nasal pit, then the nasal pit become nasal orifice when it digs deeper to make the nasal cavity. Here we see the nasal pit is surrounded by two processes. One is called medial nasal process, which is C here. It's medial and below the nasal pit. The other process is called lateral nasal process, and it's lateral and above the nasal pit. Both of these processes, medial nasal process, lateral nasal process, are part of the frontonasal process. Here we can identify also the optic placode. The optic placode is a local thickening at this stage which marks the site of future eye development. And from the placode itself, the eye lens will be derived from the placode itself, the optic placode. Here we also identify the second pharyngeal arch, which is letter G here. It's also called the hyoid arch. The maxillary process plus the mandibular process, both are from the first pharyngeal arch. So maxillary process plus mandibular process equals first pharyngeal arch. And here we have second pharyngeal arch. We have a groove between them, or cleft. This is called the first pharyngeal cleft, or first pharyngeal groove. Nasal and optic placodes arise from thickening of the ectoderm. Nasal placode sinks into the mesenchyme, forming two nasal pits. Proliferation of mesenchyme from the frontonasal process around the openings of the nasal pit produces medial and lateral nasal processes. Here we also looking at a frontal view of a human embryo during week 5. But you can see that this is more advanced in week 5 than the one we have just shown, because the pit now is deeper. The nasal pit is now deeper, so it's digging deeper, generating the nasal cavity. This histological slide is for a human embryo during week 5. Now we can identify here the nasal cavity, which leads externally to the nasal orifice. And here we can identify a membrane separating the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. This membrane will rupture by the end of week 5. So if you see this membrane separating nasal cavity from oral cavity, which is called oronasal membrane, this means that we are still in week 5, but it's toward the end of week 5. Oronasal membrane separates primitive nasal and oral cavities. The membrane ruptures by the end of week 5 to produce communication between the two cavities. In this section also we can identify the tongue here, which is attached to the mandibular process. This is the mandibular process. Also we can identify what is called maxillary isthmus, which is part of the medial nasal process, where it will later on meet up with the maxillary process. Also we see an ectodermal elevation above the maxillary isthmus. This elevation here, ectodermal elevation, is called the nasal fin. This is further illustrated here. Letter A is for nasal cavity, B oral cavity, between them the membrane, the oronasal membrane. So we are still in week 5. Here we can identify the maxillary isthmus, letter E, and above it we see an ectodermal elevation called nasal fin. The nasal fin is a sheet of epithelium in front of each nasal pit. Maxillary isthmus is a bridge of mesenchyme that joins the maxillary and medial nasal processes. Now we move to the next stage, which is week 6 in utero human embryo. You see here there is a quick or rapid development taking place during the early weeks of embryonic development. So the changes are dramatic from week to week. In this model, at week 6, we can identify here the optic vesicle. Now we call it vesicle instead of placode. Here we see that the maxillary process up here have grown further anteriorly, trying to get closer and closer to both the medial nasal process and the lateral nasal process. Here we see the mandibular process. Here we see the tongue sticking out of the oral cavity. This is because at this stage of development, the size of the oral cavity is small compared to the size of the tongue. So the tongue has no room to stay inside, no enough room to stay completely inside the oral cavity. Here we identify nasal orifice C is the lateral nasal process, which is above and lateral to the nasal orifice. Medial nasal process is medial and below the nasal orifice. We can also identify here the otic placode. Otic for ear, which marks the site of the future ear development. We have two grooves that we should be able to name in this at this stage. The first groove is between the maxillary process and the lateral nasal process, which is letter E here. It's called naso-optic furrow. Furrow is a groove. You can call it naso-optic groove. It's also called nasolacrimal groove. Nasolacrimal groove because it's the site where the nasolacrimal duct develops. The second groove between the maxillary process and the medial nasal process. This groove here. Also, you can see it here, between medial nasal process and maxillary process. This groove is called bucconasal membrane, a bucconasal groove. The two mandibular processes fuse, forming the lower jaw. Maxillary and mandibular processes meet at the angle of the mouth. From these corners, maxillary processes grow inward beneath the lateral nasal processes toward the medial nasal processes. Continuing with week 6 in utero human embryo, the naso-optic furrow is formed between the maxillary and lateral nasal processes. From each furrow, an ectodermal rod of cells sinks below the surface and canalizes to form the nasolacrimal duct. This table is an important table. This table shows the derivatives of the 5 pharyngeal arches, also the nerve supply and the blood supply of these derivatives. We can see here that we have 5 pharyngeal arches. We have the first, second, third, fourth, and sixth. Now notice we don't have 5th pharyngeal arch. We have a 6th pharyngeal arch. Why? First of all, pharyngeal arches are temporary structures that appears during embryonic development, then they disappear. But when they disappear as pharyngeal arches or as swellings or as prominences, they leave derivatives. So they transform into their derivatives. So they don't go away like they vanish. They disappear, but they leave their own derivatives. In lower vertebrates, like fish and frog, we have six pharyngeal arches instead of 5. And they are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In higher vertebrates, including mammals, and as you know, humans are mammals. We only have 5 pharyngeal arches, and the one missing compared to lower vertebrates is the 5th one, not the 6th one. That's why the numbering 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 pharyngeal arches. Also, it's important to note that in higher vertebrates, we call them pharyngeal instead of branchial arches. In lower vertebrates, we call them branchial arches. Branchial refers to gills, and you know, fish and frogs during their early development, tadpoles, they have gills. So that's why they are more appropriately called branchial arches in lower vertebrates. In higher vertebrates, they are called pharyngeal arches. Here we notice that the first pharyngeal arch is called mandibular arch. However, it has 2 processes. One is called mandibular process and the other is called maxillary process. Then we have second arch called hyoid arch, third, fourth, sixth. Notice that each arch in this table has muscular derivatives, skeletal derivatives. Skeletal derivatives includes bone and cartilage. And each one has nerve supply and blood supply. We start with the first pharyngeal arch. Look at the muscular contributions or muscular derivatives. The first pharyngeal arch gives rise to muscles of mastication, anterior belly of digastric muscle, mylohyoid, tensor tympani, tensor villi palatini muscles. So all these muscles are derived from the first pharyngeal arch, and all these muscles their nerve supply and blood supply should be from the same source. Nerve supply, here you see it's trigeminal nerve. So all these muscles have their nerve supply from the trigeminal nerve, and their blood supply from the maxillary artery. Notice that below the trigeminal nerve we have V2 and V3. V2, what these mean? V is for the 5th cranial nerve. So the trigeminal nerve is the 5th cranial nerve. We have 12 cranial nerves, and the trigeminal nerve is the 5th. V2 means the second branch of the 5th cranial nerve, the second branch of the trigeminal nerve, which is the maxillary branch. V3 means the third branch of the trigeminal nerve, which is the mandibular branch. So V2 is the maxillary branch of the trigeminal nerve, and V3 is the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. V1 for the trigeminal nerve, but it's not involved here, is the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve. Skeletal contributions of the first pharyngeal arch: maxilla, mandible. Maxilla, it's the upper jaw, but we will explain something. We'll explain it more later. that not all the upper jaw is derived from the first arch. The upper jaw has two parts actually. One is called premaxilla and one is called maxilla proper. The premaxilla carries the incisors. The area of the upper jaw that carries the incisors, central and lateral incisor, is called premaxilla, and the premaxilla is derived from the medial nasal process. The rest of the upper jaw, which carries the canine and premolars and molars, so canine plus posterior teeth, this area is this part of the upper jaw is derived from the maxillary process. So here we should make notice here that the maxilla meant here is the maxilla proper. Mandible, all the mandible is derived from the mandibular process of the first pharyngeal arch, and the maxilla proper is derived from the maxillary process of the first pharyngeal arch. Also, the skeletal contributions of the first pharyngeal arch include the incus and malleus of the middle ear. The incus is derived from the maxillary process, and the malleus is derived from the mandibular process. By the way, each pharyngeal arch is supported by a primary cartilage before bone starts to be formed. The cartilage that provides support for the maxillary process is called pterygopalatocquadrate cartilage. And the cartilage that provides support for the mandibular process is called Meckel's cartilage. Most of these cartilages resorb after bone starts to be formed. However, some parts of these cartilages transform into bone by a process called endochondral ossification. Meckel's cartilage, most of it will resorb, and a small part of it will transform into malleus, one of the three ossicles of the middle ear. Same thing for the pterygopalatocquadrate cartilage of the maxillary process. Most of it will resorb, and a small part of it will transform into the incus. Now we go to the second pharyngeal arch, which is called the hyoid arch. Muscular derivatives, muscles of facial expression, buccinator, platysma, stapedius, stylohyoid, and posterior belly of digastric. All these muscles, because they are derived from the second arch, should be supplied by the facial nerve, which is the nerve of the second arch. Facial nerve, here we see number 7 next to it because it's the 7th cranial nerve. The second pharyngeal arch the blood supply of it and all its derivatives from the stapedial artery. Notice here that the muscle, the digastric muscle, is derived from two pharyngeal arches. The anterior belly is derived from the first arch, and the posterior belly is derived from the second arch. This means that this structure is embryologically mosaic. Embryologically mosaic refers to a structure that's derived from more than one pharyngeal arch, or more than process. So this applies here. Skeletal derivatives of the second arch include the stapes, which is the third ossicle of the middle ear. And the stapes is derived from the Reichert's cartilage, which is the cartilage, the primary cartilage that provides support for the second pharyngeal arch or the hyoid arch. Also, the skeletal contribution of the second arch include the styloid process and parts of the hyoid bone, not all the hyoid bone. These parts of the hyoid bone that's derived from second arch is the lesser horn and the upper part of the body. They are derived from Reichert's cartilage. So stapes, styloid process, lesser horn and upper parts of the body of the hyoids, all derived from Reichert's cartilage by a process called endochondral ossification. And there is a ligament connecting the styloid process with the lesser horn of the hyoid bone. The ligament is called stylohyoid ligament. This ligament is derived from the perichondrium of Reichert's cartilage. Third arch, muscular contributions of the third arch. We have only one muscle, it's called stylopharyngeus. Skeletal contribution, the remainder of the hyoid bone, greater horn, and the lower part of the body. So we see here another example of an embryologically mosaic structure, the hyoid bone. Parts of it derived from the second arch and the remainder from the third arch. Nerve supply of the third arch, glossopharyngeal nerve, which is nerve number 9, the 9th cranial nerve. Blood supply from common carotid and internal carotid arteries. Fourth arch, muscular contribution, intrinsic muscles of the soft palate. Skeletal contributions, thyroid cartilage, epiglottic cartilage. Nerve supply from the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve, specifically from the superior laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve. Blood supply, the right side from the right subclavian artery, the left side from the aortic arch. Sixth arch give rise to intrinsic muscles of the larynx. Skeletal contributions of the sixth arch, cricoid cartilage, arytenoid cartilages, and corniculate cartilages. These are the cartilages of the larynx. Some of the cartilages of the larynx. The cartilages of the larynx include thyroid cartilage, epiglottic, cricoid, arytenoid, corniculate. All these cartilages are called laryngeal cartilages, or the cartilages of the larynx. So we see that the fourth and the sixth together contribute to the formation of the laryngeal cartilages. The fourth give rise to the thyroid cartilage, which is Adam's apple, also called Adam's apple, and the epiglottic cartilage. The remainder of the cartilages of the larynx, cricoid, arytenoid, corniculate, are derived from the sixth arch. Nerve supply of the sixth arch and its derivatives, vagus nerve, specifically the recurrent laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve. Blood supply, the right side, get blood supply from the right pulmonary artery. The left side get its supply from pulmonary artery and ductus arteriosus. Here we are looking at a human embryo, week 7. We see here more of growth taking place. So here we see the maxillary process is getting closer and closer. The groove separating it from the medial nasal and lateral nasal processes are getting narrower and narrower. So they are preparing to fuse to each other. You see maxillary process, mandibular process here. Medial nasal, lateral nasal, nasal orifice. This groove here between maxillary process and medial nasal, so we call it bucconasal groove. This groove here between lateral nasal and maxillary process, we call it naso-optic groove, or naso-optic furrow, or nasolacrimal groove. Now we'll talk about the development of the upper lip. The upper lip is again another example of an embryologically mosaic structure. Part of it derived from the medial nasal process and part of it derived from the maxillary process. This part of the lip, the central part, is called the philtrum of the upper lip. This is derived from medial nasal processes. We have two medial nasal processes, one right, one left. They fuse together in the center. One of their contributions is the philtrum of the upper lip. The remainder of the upper lip is derived from the maxillary process. This is from the right side, the right maxillary process, and this is from the left maxillary process. So the upper lip derived from medial nasal process plus maxillary process. Here you see the mandibular process. All of the lower jaw, also the lower lip, derived from the same process, which is the mandibular process of the first pharyngeal arch. Here we notice that the medial nasal process not only give rise to the philtrum of the upper lip, but also contribute to the mid region of the nose, central region of the nose. Also, the central region of the nasal cavity. Also, the premaxilla, as we mentioned before, which is the area of the upper jaw that carries the incisors. Lateral nasal process contribute to this area. Here, the sides, the lateral area of the nose, the ala of the nose here, and this part of the face. We have two different theories for the upper lip development. Maxillary process outgrow the medial nasal process and meet in the midline. This is not the most accepted theory. The most accepted theory is this one. Maxillary processes meet the medial nasal process, thus the middle third of the lip is derived from the frontonasal process, specifically from the medial nasal process, because as we know, the medial nasal process is part of the frontonasal process. Now we'll talk about the development of the palate. The palate is the roof of the oral cavity. It separates the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. The palate, we have hard palate anteriorly, soft palate posteriorly. The hard palate is supported by bone. That's why it's called hard palate. And the soft palate is supported by muscle. That's why it's called soft palate. And further back in the soft palate area, in the center, we have a process or elevation called the uvula. So the palate includes the hard palate, soft palate, and uvula. This is anatomical description. The embryologic description of the palate is primary palate and secondary palate. Primary palate is part of the hard palate, is the most anterior part of the hard palate that is derived from the medial nasal process. It's the part of the hard palate that correspond to the incisors, central and lateral incisor. So it's part of the premaxilla. And as we explained before, the premaxilla is derived from the medial nasal process. The remainder of the hard palate, plus the soft palate, plus the uvula, is called the secondary palate, and it's derived from the maxillary process, specifically from what is called lateral palatal shelves. Each maxillary process gives rise to a lateral palatal shelf, and these two shelves meet eventually in the midline, fuse together, and form the secondary palate. During the 6th week of intrauterine life, the nasal cavities are separated by a nasal septum. At this stage, this is called the primary nasal septum. Nasal cavities are separated from the oral cavity by primary palate, which is here. This is primary palate. So the primary palate forms during week 6, during intrauterine life. And as we explained, the primary palate is derived from the median nasal process. The nasal septum and the primary palate are derivatives of the frontonasal process, specifically from the medial nasal process. Two lateral palatal shelves, this one and this one. Two lateral palatal shelves develop behind the primary palate. This is the primary palate here. The lateral palatal shelves are derived from the maxillary processes. The secondary nasal septum develops behind the primary septum. So we have here secondary nasal septum separating the two parts of the nasal cavity. This is posterior to the primary nasal septum, which separates the anterior parts of the nasal cavities, the right from the left nasal cavity. Forget about this labeling here. Here we are comparing two stages of development. It shows different stages of palate development. Both of these sections are called coronal sections. Coronal sections. We see nasal cavities here, right, left, oral cavity, same thing, nasal cavity, nasal cavity. Between the two nasal cavities we have nasal septum. Here we can identify two palatal shelves. Maxillary process, lateral palatal shelf. At this stage, you see that the tongue is sticking up because the oral cavity is small and the tongue is large. This forced the lateral palatal shelves to grow vertically at the sides of the tongue because they cannot grow horizontally to meet each other at this stage. So they are forced to grow vertically. This is characteristics of week 7. Week 7 during intrauterine life. We identify here Meckel's cartilage, the cartilage that supports the mandibular process. We see mandibular bone, developing mandibular bone. See that Meckel's cartilage doesn't give rise to mandibular bone. It provides support for it, but doesn't transform into mandibular bone. And mandibular bone is formed lateral to Meckel's cartilage and in the anterior region, anterior to Meckel's cartilage. Here we see tooth germ. These are the one of the first signs of tooth development. Also here we see tooth germ here, up here. Here we see nasal cavity, nasal cavity. This is nasal septum. We have two nasal septa, primary and secondary. What we should call this, primary or secondary nasal septum? We should call it secondary. Why? Because here we have palatal shelves. The palatal shelves are part of maxillary process. The two lateral palatal shelves will give rise to secondary palate. So in the region of the secondary palate, the nasal septum we have is called secondary nasal septum. The stage of development, when you see vertical growth of the lateral palatal shells, this is week 7. Week 7 intrauterine life. Here we see in this stage the oral cavity is larger. So the tongue drops down. It has more space now. This is week 8. Characteristic of week 8 is the horizontal growth of the lateral palatal shelves. Because the tongue drops down, because of the oral cavity is getting bigger during week 8, the lateral palatal shelves now can grow horizontally to meet each other's eventually in the midline. So when you see horizontal growth of the palatal shelves, then it's week 8. But still, they haven't contacted each other yet. The initial contact of these two lateral palatal shelves will take place by the end of week 8. So this section here is for week 8 human embryo. Here you see nasal cavity, secondary nasal septum, lateral palatal shelf. See Meckel's cartilage, developing mandibular bone, tooth germ. Go to the next slide. Week 7, characteristics of week 7, as you see here, vertical growth of lateral palatal shelves. The primary oral cavity becomes filled with developing tongue. Palatal shelves keep on growing till they lie vertically. So letter A here, lateral palatal shelf. B, developing tongue. Here we see Meckel's cartilage, developing mandibular bone, tooth germ. Again, developing mandibular bone, Meckel's cartilage, tooth germ. Week 8. What's characteristic about week 8 is the horizontal growth of lateral palatal shelves. The stomodium enlarges, the tongue drops due to change in shape and mandibular growth. The palatal shelves become horizontal and contact each other. Their initial contact is by the end of week 8. Their contact forms secondary palate. So the secondary palate is basically two lateral palatal shelves in contact with each other. This is lateral palatal shelf. Together, they are called secondary palate. This is primary palate. The fusion, of course, takes place between each lateral palatal shelf with primary palate, then the two lateral palatal shelves fuse together after their contact anterior posteriorly, like like a zipper. So they fuse anteriorly, then continue up posteriorly. The last part where contact and fusion, always fusion follows contact. First contact, then fusion. The last part to be where the two lateral palatal shelves contact each other, then fuse together, is the uvula, which is here. From week 8 to 12, secondary palate contacts the primary palate to divide the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. The fusion is completed during the 12th week in utero. Here it's fusion, which follows contact. Behind the secondary nasal septum, the shelves fuse to form the soft palate and the uvula. In this section here, we see lateral palatal shelf, lateral palatal shelf. Now they are not only in contact with each other, they have initiated a fusion. The initiation of fusion starts after week 9. So this will be at least week 10. And the fusion is complete during week 12. So this section is sometime between week 10 and week 12. Although it appears closer to week 10. Might be week 10 or week 11. See here, there is an ectoderm here. Epithelium. This epithelium is called midline epithelial seam. So when the two lateral palatal shelves first fully contact each other, the full contact, we mentioned before, the initial contact is by the end of week 8. And the full contact is during week 9. Full contact. But not fusion yet. So they're contacting, but there is an ectoderm separating them, which is called midline epithelial seam. So after week 9, week 10 till week 12, this seam, this epithelial seam, midline epithelial seam, disintegrates. And we see part of this disintegration taking place here in this section. So this seam is not continuous. In this section, it's not solid. We can identify discontinuity here. It means that it started resorbing. It started disintegration. So this would be after week 9. And of course, before week 12. Because week 12 would be complete disintegration of this seam. So here, as we say, lateral palatal shelf, you can call it secondary palate at this stage, because now they are in full, now they have contacted each other. C is midline epithelial seam. B B here is part of the secondary nasal septum. You can call it secondary nasal septum. If you want to be specific, you can call it secondary nasal cartilage. And around it you can identify bone. Bone in this type of stain appears turquoise in color. Here we see developing maxillary bone. Here we see developing palatine bone. Again on the other side, developing maxillary bone, developing palatine bone, oral cavity, nasal cavity, nasal cavity. The epithelium at the medial edges of the palatal shelves fuse together to form epithelial seam. This is the midline epithelial seam between the two fusing lateral palatal shelves. The seam disintegrates to allow mesenchymal continuity across the secondary palate. This is mesenchyme, this is mesenchyme. When this epithelium in between the seam disintegrates, there will be continuity between the mesenchymes of the two palatal shelves. Ossification of the hard palate starts once the fusion of the palatal shelves is complete. The bone of the palate and the bone of the maxilla, both are formed by intramembranous ossification. Intramembranous ossification means that the bone is formed directly from mesenchymal cells without going through the cartilage stage. The other type is called endochondral ossification, where the mesenchyme give rise to cartilage and then the cartilage is replaced by bone. But here, in this case here, in the palate and the maxilla, we have the type of ossification, intramembranous ossification. Intramembranous ossification from 4 centers, 1 in each developing maxilla and 1 in each palatine bone. So 2 on each side, 4 in total. Letter A here, developing maxillary bone. B here, developing palatine bone. C here, nasal cavity. So in this side we have 2, developing maxillary bone, developing palatine bone. The other side we have 2, so we have 4 in total. I want you to notice here the arrows here pointing at large cells on this surface of the bone. And look at the other side, we have small cells. At this side we have osteoclasts. Osteoclasts, they are resorbing the bone. On the other side, we have smaller cells which are osteoblasts. Osteoblasts form bone. So here, on this side, toward the nasal cavity, we have osteoclasts. They are resorbing the bone. If resorption takes place only, then the bone will disappear. So to compensate for that, the other side have osteoblasts which form new bone to compensate for the resorption. What this tells you that the nasal cavity at this stage is increasing in size. It's growing in size. To allow this growth, the palatine bone should resorb from the side close to the nasal cavity to allow this growth. Otherwise, the bone will be an obstacle toward growth. And for the bone not to completely be resorbed, the other side, we have new bone formation. Okay, here we see 3 stages of secondary palate development. First stage here, always look at the palatal shelves. Palatal shelves, vertical growth, week 7. Palatal shelves, horizontal growth, and you see initial contact. It's not full contact yet, just touch. This is by the end of week 8. This is 7th. This is by the end of week 8. And here we see full contact between the lateral palatal shelves, but no fusion yet, because the midline epithelial seam is intact. So this is 9th, the 9th week in utero. Coronal sections through human embryos at approximately 7 weeks. Initial disposition of palatine shelves on each side of the tongue, which is here. 8th week, elevation coincident with depression of the tongue. And week 9, full contact, but not yet fusion. References: Perkovitz, Oral Anatomy, Histology, Embryology, Tinkates, and Orban's Oral Histology. Thanks a lot for listening, and next week we'll talk about the second part of facial development. Thank you very much, and meet you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.